Hey everyone! Welcome back to the Genshin Impact Chronicle. Today's episode is all about Mondstadt, specifically Old Mondstadt. Mondstadt is known as the City of Freedom today. However, it wasn't always like this. In Mondstadt's past, it was actually ruled by a bunch of tyrants and dictators, and had a pretty bloody history. So, how did it become the city that we know and love today? The city of freedom, and of wine, and of dandelions? Well, we are going to unpack all of that rich history, and we are going to find out how Mondstadt came to be the city we know and love today. So let's get started. To tell the story of Mondstadt's history would be incomplete without discussing Andrius and Decarabian. We all probably know about Andrius, maybe a little too well. Andrius is also known as Boreas, or if you're like me, the Wolf Boss. Anyone else have fond memories of battling Boreas every week and struggling because your team just wasn't leveled up enough, but you also needed to fight him to get those level up materials? And then having a very full team and not being able to feed them anymore? I can't be the only one who struggled with this early on as a new player, so leave your stories in the comments below. I would love to hear everyone's experiences. So, who is Andrius anyway? On the surface, he just seems like an icy and windy ghost of a god from the past. But his real story started thousands of years ago, when an ancient god gave Andrius his powers, thus making Andrius a god himself. But it was during the Archon War that a dispute arose between him and Decarabian, thus starting a feud that lasted for hundreds of years. Stop! Before we get too caught up in the hostility of Andrius and Decarabian, you may be asking yourself, who is Decarabian? The name might sound familiar as it's attached to some weapon ascension materials, the Decarabian tiles, but Decarabian was actually known as the god of storms and was the first Animo Archon, though he wasn't one of the 7. Genshin does not tell us of Decarabian's origins, but we do know that he was the one who originally founded Mondstadt. The city was based in what we now know as Storm Terror's lair. This is where Andrius enters the scene, and we can resume our story. A dispute arose between the gods, and with Andrius's icy powers, he turned the land into an icy tundra. For this reason, Decarabian sealed up his city with powerful wind barriers, so powerful that even Andrius in all his strength couldn't break. But Decarabian was a bit delusional. While he thought he was protecting his citizens from the harsh outer world, his people actually saw him as a controlling tyrant and resented the very wind barrier that was supposed to protect them. Decarabian even thought that his people were bowing to him out of reverence and adoration, when in reality, they were bent over and struggling because of his wind barriers. It's actually stated in Volume 1 of the Teyvat Travel Guide that Decarabian was a very controlling ruler and had even dictated where each person was living. Yeah, that's not cool. Well, it wasn't long before the people had just had enough, and a rebellion soon arose consisting of a small wind spirit and a bard. Now, this bard, we don't really know anything about him. We don't even know his name, which is why he is commonly referred to as the Nameless Bard. So with this bard and the small wind spirit, as well as others such as the Gunhilder clan and the Roggenvinder clan, they rose up and were soon victorious in their rebellion, and Decarabian was eventually slain. With his death, his mighty wind barrier disappeared, and the people were finally free. Now, the small wind spirit started gaining and growing in power, and eventually he took Decarabian's place as Anemo Archon and even ascended to godhood, becoming Barbados and one of the seven. We'll leave his story there for now. We'll discuss Barbados in more detail in a future episode, so stay tuned. But what happened to Andrius, you might ask? After discovering that he couldn't break Decarabian's wind barriers, what did he do? This feud between Andrius and Decarabian took place during the Archon War, a period of time where gods fought amongst themselves to determine who would become the Seven. Andrius had wanted to become the Anemo Archon, but ultimately decided that he could not become this Archon because, in his eyes, an Archon should have love for humanity, something that Andrius did not think he had. However, I find his views a bit contradictory because he decided to pass on after realizing his blizzards could only hurt humanity and not nourish it. That seems like love to me. He let his powers seep into the land as a way of protecting it, and he himself became an icy spirit. Later, Andrius would become one of the four winds, and the Temple of the Wolf was used to worship him. So, what happened to Mondstadt after Decarabian's death? Well, we shall soon find out. In the next episode, we will talk more about Mondstadt's history and what happened after Decarabian's rule in the next episode, so stay tuned. But now, it's time for Theories of Teyvat. This is a section in the podcast where we do some theory crafting on Genshin's lore, talk about the what-ifs and what could-have-beens, and why did this happen the way it did. Now, just to be clear, we're not talking about any sort of leaks in the game or anything that hasn't been released yet. This is just our opinion and what we think could be going on behind the scenes. So, what exactly were Andrius and Decarabian fighting about anyway? Well, Genshin doesn't tell us. One theory is that they were fighting over who was to become the Anemo Archon of the Seven. We know Decarabian was the current Anemo Archon, though not one of the seven, and seeing as how their feud took place during the Archon War, this seems a plausible theory. Maybe Andrius was challenging Decarabian's right to be Anemo Archon. Another theory is that maybe Andrius saw Decarabian's personality and controlling nature and lack of love for his people and wanted to put a stop to it. We certainly saw Decarabian's true colors once that wind barrier went up, so maybe Andrius saw hints of it. Ultimately, we don't know, but what are your thoughts? Leave them in the comments below, and let's talk about them. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and maybe even learned a thing or two. We'll be back in the next episode talking more about Mondstadt's history. And for those of you who have read the Genshin manga, we will be talking about some very familiar faces. But that's all for now. Ad Astra Abyssosque, travelers!